come and go, though. That makes it summertime. There's a break from the routine, and where the possibility is to sit in longer staus than normal. Ute said they were in 4 hours of stau going up to the Ostsee. So if you enjoy more stau, go on vacation with your car. And where the plans for vacation this year are also affected by fire and flood. How many different places we saw just this week where flood waters have made vacationers seek higher ground, and other times we've had the fire. So it's not been a normal year of vacation. And one doesn't really know what will come next. And yet for most of us, life will be pretty much the same, actually, with minor changes here and there. Our faith doesn't actually take a break, does it? It's not like we take a vacation from God, or do we? This temptation to take a faith break is probably a Western one. Or at least it suggests for some that faith is an on and off thing. Looking at our world, the majority of people on the planet are not thinking about vacations, but about survival. I've often thought about that in these days. So many different news stories are about everybody, their vacations being disturbed and they're upset and whatnot. And I often think in the back of my mind, there are people having that all year long. And we are on a luxury concept of going on vacation, and I'm not putting down that possibility, of course, but trying to relativize it with realities as many people have them on the planet. In this season, then, where partially or potentially people feel like faith issues might be on and off, what should we focus on as a community? That was my question to myself as a pastor. Several verses in Hebrews 10, 23 through 25 have caught my attention, and that's going to be a focus now for the next 4 weeks of August. These verses, and I want to read them from Hebrews 10, 23 through 25. Let us hold tightly, without wavering, to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promises. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. If you would read the book of Hebrews, and it's not a long book, but a very interesting book, he's already shown how significant Jesus has been in their lives. Because Jesus gave his life and shed his blood, now these people have a direct access to the very presence of God. They never had that before. Never had that before. Now, since Pentecost, we have had the wonderful opportunity to learn to live in resonance with God. I think we could dwell on that almost all year long, and we should never forget that. That is always significant. And this is only possible because of Jesus. This resonance with God, this ability to really get in direct relationship with God, is because of what Jesus did. And as I said before, Jesus always identified in solidarity from the bottom up. If you read in Philippians, what does it say about Jesus? He came down. He came down and went from the bottom up. The challenge, of course, is to keep this wonder and awe of this privilege alive in ourselves. Not to forget the beauty of this resonance with God. As humans, we can get all tied up in other things, and we can lose the wonder. We can lose the mystery. We can lose the beauty of knowing Jesus. We can get so used to it, and we can maybe categorize it as our Sunday thing, rather than being a daily, life-giving thing. Knowing Jesus is not just Sunday-related. It's every moment of our life related, which is exciting, but challenges us. We can lose the wonder. I doubt if the early Christians were much different from us, although the circumstances were different. But the temptation to lose the original dynamic of this awesome connection to God through Jesus, well, that is always there. To lose the praise, to lose the thanksgiving, to lose the awe. That's why we actually gather and sing these kinds of songs, to remind us from week to week, don't forget the awe. Don't forget the praise. And we can do that when we're living often in our own little bubble throughout the week, in our own little world. If we're not conscious about this, we can lose it. Now the struggles these early Christians faced included persecution, and I appreciate Ava's prayer for the persecuted. And you know, it was wearing them down. If you read later on in that chapter, it's clearly described. The writer says, think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful even though it meant terrible suffering. I read today, pain is not optional, but suffering often is. I thought that was interesting. Pain is what makes us all human. You know, if you hurt yourself and you have pain, well, you're alive. You're part of sharing the universal sense of being human. But suffering often is something we can identify with or not identify with. We can identify with people who are really going through suffering by really having solidarity with them. That's an interesting question. But the people in our text had gone through terrible suffering. And the writer says sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule and were beaten. And sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail. And when all you owned was taken from you. Think about that for a moment. All they owned was taken from them because they were Christians. We read recently or heard in the news just not this long, in India there is a lot of persecution in some of the areas right now. And these are things that other people on the planet are suffering from. They're things that they've been given, their homes are being torn apart. It's hard for us to imagine because of faith having that happen, but it's true. And the Hebrew writer says, when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You know there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So he says to these dear ones, so now do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. With this background in mind, our verse for today has deep significance. Hold on tight. We're looking at just the first verse 23. Let us hold tightly, without wavering, to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. In this verse, we see the basis for hope despite all challenges. God can be trusted to keep his promise. Michael Eaton writes, hope is faith that looks ahead. Hope is faith that looks ahead. It is faith that anticipates that one will be rewarded by events which will take place later. Complementing this Another commentator suggests that we can hold on to hope as an anticipation that the promise given to Abraham would be fulfilled in the days of the readers because of Jesus' sacrifice. Many of the early Christians, because of Jesus, felt, now it's going to happen. Now the fulfillment will come. Now is the time. Imagine when that time stretched out. What happens to hope then? So in this midst of all these challenges, this short phrase, hold on tight, has a sort of a commanding word, impact about it. So I was thinking about this verse. I looked ahead in Hebrews and saw chapter 11, where people of faith are listed, the faith chapter. And I wondered, was this an underlining of the message that these verses have here for us? People actually held on to the promises without the fulfilling presence of Christ. They simply looked forward. It says they looked forward in anticipation of the time when Jesus would come in fulfillment. They lived faithfully in anticipation. They looked forward, and that helped them to remain firm in the present. And wouldn't that be a strong possibility for these new believers now? And isn't it a strong possibility for us in the midst of our living? To hold on tight. Even before Abraham, the father of faith, there was Noah. And if there was ever someone who held on tightly, it was Noah. He only had that naked promise that God would bring him through an extremely strenuous, life-threatening challenge. He only had a promise. Think about it. Noah did not give up on hope, even though everything he had known in his life was being destroyed. His entire previous life. I think it's something to consider. The story of Noah was so dramatic and powerful that Jesus referred to him and his times as an emotional way to feel the times that will come before he returns. Jesus said, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days before the Son of Man returns. I think that's a head-up call for us. I think we feel this worldwide turbulence all around us. I don't know about you, I do. But I see that when I add up all of these different places and I think, whoa, that's an awful lot happening on our planet. There always have been times like that, of course. But we are now so interconnected, we're aware. We're very aware of the dynamic nature of all that is happening. Every corner in the world seems to be touched by events that shake up everything. And Noah felt his times personally. He felt his times. He saw what was happening in the society around him, and he heard God speaking to him with a saving message. That's interesting. There was turbulence. He saw it, he felt it, and yet his ears were not plugged. He heard what God was saying, and it was a saving message for him. And Noah became totally dependent on God. Totally. He believed that God would keep his promise to save him, and that alone gave him hope. I was thinking, how many promises do we have? We have so many promises. Could we not grasp a few that Jesus has given to us, or the promise of the presence of the Spirit in our lives, and hold tightly to them? Noah heard a promise from God and held tightly to it, And so Noah built the huge boat called the ark because of God. It wasn't his idea. Noah collected the animals, not because he loved animals necessarily, but because God told him to collect them. Noah did the rest of the organizational stuff that needed to be done because God told him to do it. And Noah entered the ark because of God. And then there was the great wait. I think this waiting in this ark was perhaps the most difficult thing in this entire story of Noah. Waiting. To be active sometimes is easier than to wait. There are many things none of us can change in our personal lives. We can't be active in many of the things that are part of our lives. There's nothing we can do. Waiting is hard. Noah had entered the boat as the rain began to fall, and God shut the door, as you recall. In a way, for Noah, that meant there was no turning back. There's no way out. Alfred always tells a joking story about our wedding day. Jerry Johnson was with him in the sacristy of the little church in Winona where we got married. And there was a door that was a bit open. And Jerry Johnson teasingly said to Alfred, "Now, if you want to leave, now's your chance. There's the open door." Alfred, if you know him, you know he was kind of like, what a shock. But that was a joke. But in this case, Noah had no open door. There was no way out of this boat unless God was there, you see. I was thinking the ark is often the sense of the church. The New Testament sees the ark as a sense of the church. Is there a way where we commit ourselves to the Lord and we often sing that song, "No Turning Back"? No turning back. There is no open door for Noah when he decided to build and follow the Lord and commit himself to the Lord. In a way, when you are at these positions, there's a sense of surrender needed. Actually, Noah had to surrender himself to God's promise. Actively surrender. There are times in our lives when we have to lay it down and trust God. Lay it down and trust God. And there was no opening the door to let anyone else in either. And there must have been lots of loud shouting and banging on the door by the people outside of safety. I would imagine that. In all of the pictures that I have seen of the ark, there were never any big windows where you could look outside and see what was going on. It was like there was a place around the ark that allowed air to come in, obviously, and later on to let a bird in and out to see if it was time to get out of the boat or not. But there was no way of looking what happened to all the people. He didn't see all of the destruction taking place. But couldn't you imagine hearing a lot of very fearful things outside? And the rain pounding on the roof was loud enough and powerful enough to instill a deep awe in what was happening. I was thinking of all the water we've seen lately. I was thinking, a lot of people have often joked about Noah and the ark and the water filling the earth. Can you imagine the amount of time in the Bible that said all the rain and stuff? If that was happening in some of the areas we've seen recently in Austria and Slovenia, if that was happening for 40 days, that kind of rain, what would happen? Would be no joke. Everything would be covered and the mountains would begin to slide down. I mean, we're talking about disastrous stuff. And it was clear, therefore, to Noah, even though he was in the ark, he heard this massive amount of water falling. He heard the noises outside. All that he had known before the flood was now gone. It was all washed away. His previous life was gone. I was thinking about this kind of anguish, this human anguish, when I saw some of the scenes in Turkey this past week where they were interviewing people that are still in desperate straits since the earthquake took place there. Some of the people still going out to the piles of what was used to be their home on the ground, and people just sitting there thinking about the loss of life and not really having any place to really be. They were saying if there needs to be better shelters in winter, they're just in tents now. If there's not something done, these people will freeze in the winter. It's very cold there. Or I was thinking about another awareness. 3 years ago was this explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. 3 years ago. 3 years ago. And a family was interviewed who had lost their 3-year-old daughter in that explosion. She was just taken in a moment of time. And they're now trying to find who is responsible for all of these things, and it's almost impossible. So now they face ongoing rubble in their lives, and then we could add on the pictures of flooding that we have already seen, Austria, Slovenia, but Japan and China too had massive amounts of water. Human life is not a given. We cannot take things for granted, can we? That everything's just going to remain stable. I think sometimes we get into a bit of a, I don't want to say fantasy, that our lives are going to remain stable. Everything else can fall around in the rest of the world. We're going to be safe. Really? Do we have that assurance? No. And what can be done in the waiting is the interesting question. Noah could only live in hope because he trusted that God would keep his promise. He trusted that God would keep his promise, and that gave him the hope he needed in the waiting period. Trust only becomes robust when it's put to the test, doesn't it? We can talk about faith and trust all we want to when things smooth sailing, no ruffles in the water. We sang a couple songs about the ocean song and the waves and everything. And when everything's smooth, we're fine. It's when the waves get really rapidly bashing us and the waters become rough. When that begins to happen, trust can become robust and strong, or you just give up. Just as Noah clung to the rocking ark as it floated uncertainly, he must have clung at times to the sides of that ark. And you realize there was no motor in the ark. And I don't think there was any way to steer that huge thing. He could do nothing about where this ark was going. He had no control over the ark. Noah had to trust that God would not let them sink or crash, but bring them through safely. He held on tight. The temptation is to let faith and hope slip through our fingers in times of duress or exceptional stress. Waiting out the storms is only possible when we hold on tight to the promises of God's presence and his words of deliverance. Trust means hold on tight. Remember the story in the New Testament with Jesus and his disciples when they took that boat trip? They were crossing the lake together. Everything was lovely when they first started out, but mid-lake, a tremendous wind came down from the mountainous areas around there and created tremendous waves and wind. It picked up intensity. It got higher and higher, the waves, until the waves began to wash over the sides of their boat. And remember what the disciples thought was going to happen? We're going to drown. It's over. It's over. They felt the threat. It was there, wet. A wet threat. The disciples thought it is over, we're going to drown. But you know, Jesus was with them. And the disciples woke him up and shouted out in fear for their lives, "Lord, save us." And Jesus simply told the wind and the waves to calm down. And then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? You have so little faith." The disciples were learning who Jesus was. They were learning about him. Their faith would grow. But at that point, they were still like, what? What's happening? How can we trust this one? How can we trust Jesus? Noah held on tight to the promises God had given him. He nurtured hope by a confidence that God would indeed keep his promise. This story was well known to the listeners of the Hebrew letter. They connected the dots when they were reminded, "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise." No matter where you are on your journey, no matter what waves and wind you're battling, remember God's promises to you and hold on tightly. He will keep his promise. He always has. And he always will. And all the people said, Amen. Amen.